The attic had always been a mystery in the old Victorian house my boss, Mr. Sterling, had inherited. It was a place rarely ventured into, shrouded in whispers and the lingering scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. I had only recently taken on the role of managing his estate, keeping things in order, attending to minor repairs, and handling the odd job list he provided. One misty autumn morning, he asked me to retrieve a box labeled Family Records from the attic. I hadn't expected much of the place: a few dusty trunks, maybe an old rocking chair, relics of a family legacy too heavy for daily remembrance. As I climbed the stairs, I felt the air grow cooler, the kind of chill that had little to do with temperature and more with a timeless silence, as if the attic were holding its breath. When I reached the top, a figure emerged in the faint light filtering through the small, frosted window. At first, I felt a jolt of surprise. Standing there, almost as if she had materialized from the shadows themselves, was Mr. Sterling's sister, Eleanor. She was someone I'd met only once or twice, a reserved, graceful woman who carried herself with a quiet dignity and an unmistakable intensity. "Oh, you startled me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, almost as if afraid to disrupt the stillness. She offered a small smile, her eyes holding an intensity that felt both welcoming and challenging. "I didn't mean to surprise you. I only come up here to think," she replied softly, her gaze traveling around the room, as if it held memories she hadn't yet let go. I nodded, unsure of what to say. There was something magnetic about her presence, something that made the air around her feel charged, almost electric. The dust floating in the beam of light from the window seemed to dance in slow motion, as if even time itself had slowed down to accommodate her presence. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice like the softest note of a forgotten song, lingering long after the sound itself had faded. "Not yet," I managed, pulling myself back to the task at hand. But as I stepped further into the attic, my movements felt unsteady, as if I were stepping into some invisible boundary I hadn't known existed. As I moved deeper into the attic, I couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's gaze was following me, steady and unreadable. Her presence was a quiet storm, both inviting and cautious. She moved gracefully through the scattered beams of light, her fingers brushing over dusty objects, as if reacquainting herself with memories that lingered in the shadows. I spotted a stack of boxes near the far wall, each labeled in her brother's neat, methodical handwriting. I crouched down, squinting to read the faded ink, looking for the one labeled Family Records. Just as I found it, and began to lift the box, Eleanor's soft voice drifted over to me. "Do you ever feel like these things hold pieces of us?" she asked, her voice so quiet I nearly missed it over the sound of the creaking floorboards. I turned to see her standing only a few feet away, closer than before, her expression unreadable, a slight tilt to her head as if she were studying me. Her question seemed to hang in the air, weighty and enigmatic, so I considered my response carefully. "I suppose they do. Memories attached to objects, like bookmarks in our lives." Eleanor's lips curved into a faint, almost wistful smile, as if my answer had touched on some hidden truth. She took a step closer, the dust swirling around her in the soft light, and I caught the subtle scent of lavender and something else, something warm, like cedar or amber, that lingered in the cool attic air. "I think you might be right," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper now. Her gaze held mine for a moment, a charged silence stretching between us. It was as though we were both aware of something unspoken, something simmering just beneath the surface. I was suddenly acutely aware of her presence, the way she moved with such poised elegance, every small gesture seemingly intentional, almost hypnotic. My pulse quickened, and I felt a strange thrill ripple through me, one I couldn't quite place. Eleanor's gaze lingered on me, her expression softening, yet holding an intensity that made it hard to look away. She lifted her hand, her fingers hovering just above my arm, and for a moment, I thought she might reach out, might close that small distance between us. But instead she hesitated, letting her hand fall back to her side, though the air still felt heavy with anticipation. "I didn't expect anyone else to be up here," she admitted, her voice soft. "I only come up here when I need a moment to escape." Her words trailed off, and her eyes flickered with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before, a glimpse behind the poised exterior she wore like a mask. Without really thinking, I took a step closer, feeling the boundary between us shift, dissolve, as though we'd entered some secret world where time and place were irrelevant. I understand. Sometimes it feels like places like this hold on to secrets, like they're waiting for someone to come and unearth them. Eleanor's eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of surprise, perhaps even approval, in her expression. She reached up, her fingers lightly brushing a strand of hair that had fallen loose from her careful updo. I found myself watching her movements, entranced by the subtle grace in every small motion. There was a long pause as we stood there, just a breath apart, either of us speaking. The silence between us grew thicker, like a quiet invitation neither of us dared to acknowledge. I felt my heart beating faster, the pulse of it loud in my ears as her gaze lingered on mine, unwavering and intense. And then, almost imperceptibly, she took another step closer, her hand finally reaching out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of my shirt, so lightly it could have been a passing thought. The contact, brief as it was, sent a shiver through me, and I realized then that we were standing at the edge of something, a line that once crossed could never be undone. Eleanor's fingers lingered for a moment longer, her touch warm against the cool air, and then, as if deciding something, she let her hand fall away, her gaze dropping to the floor. She seemed almost as taken aback by her own actions as I was, her usual composure slipping, if only for a heartbeat. "I should let you get back to your work," she murmured, her voice barely audible. But she made no move to leave, her presence still heavy, like a shadow that lingered even after the light had changed. I didn't want her to go. The thought surprised me, but I couldn't ignore the pull I felt, the strange, unexplainable connection that had sparked between us in this forgotten corner of the house. I took a steadying breath, finding words where I hadn't expected to find them. "You don't have to leave," I said quietly, my voice sounding almost foreign in the stillness. "We could stay a bit longer." Eleanor lifted her gaze, her eyes meeting mine with an unreadable intensity. For a moment, it felt as though the room itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, in a movement that felt both tentative and deliberate, she closed the remaining distance between us. We were only inches apart now, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, close enough that I could see the slight rise and fall of her breath. Her gaze held mine, unwavering, and I knew in that moment that we were past the point of no return, caught in something that defied reason and resisted explanation. Her hand lifted once more, and this time, she didn't hesitate. Her fingers brushed my cheek, the touch feather-light yet electrifying, as though she were tracing the outline of a memory we both long forgotten. I found myself leaning into her touch, unable to resist the pull, as if she had cast a spell that bound me to her, heart and soul. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat stretching out as she stepped even closer, her breath warm against my skin. And then, before I could think, before I could even breathe, her lips were on mine, soft and warm, an invitation and a promise all at once. The kiss was soft at first, a gentle brush of lips that felt both tentative and intense, as if testing the waters of something far deeper than either of us had anticipated. My hand instinctively moved to her waist, feeling the warmth of her through the delicate fabric of her blouse. She leaned into me, her hands finding their way to my shoulders, and I felt a surge of heat course through me, a quiet thrill that left me breathless. It was impossible to ignore the way her touch lingered, how the kiss deepened, each moment carrying us further into an intimacy either of us had planned, yet both of us couldn't resist. Her fingers slid down my arm, igniting a trail of sensation in their wake, and I felt myself drawn in, caught in the intensity of her presence, as though nothing else in the world existed beyond this moment. We broke apart briefly, both of us breathing hard, eyes locked, a silent understanding passing between us that words could never capture. There was no need to explain, no need to question. What was happening between us felt inevitable, as though every decision we had ever made had led us here, to this attic, to this kiss, to each other. Her eyes searched mine, as if seeking reassurance, as if we were both standing at the edge of something vast and uncharted. Slowly, her hand slid down to my hand, fingers entwining with mine in a silent plea, and I gave a gentle squeeze, a wordless promise that we were in this together, wherever it might lead. Without a word, she led me toward an old armchair in the corner of the attic, its fabric worn and faded, yet somehow adding to the intimacy of the moment. We sat down, the air around us charged with anticipation, every glance, every touch magnified in the quiet solitude of the attic. She rested her hand on my cheek, her fingers grazing my skin with a tenderness that made my chest ache. This wasn't something I ever expected," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if admitting a long-held secret. "Neither did I," I replied, my hand covering hers, savoring the warmth of her touch, the quiet vulnerability in her gaze. "But here we are." A soft smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, and she leaned forward again, her lips brushing mine, a slow, lingering kiss that felt like an invitation to explore the depths of a connection we'd only just begun to uncover. I felt her hands slide over my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I responded instinctively, letting myself be guided by the unspoken bond growing between us. Each kiss, each touch, seemed to open a door within me, awakening feelings I hadn't known I was capable of. Her hands moved with a gentle urgency, exploring, learning, as if mapping out the contours of this new and fragile connection. There was a gentleness to her touch, a carefulness that spoke of restraint, but beneath it, I could sense a yearning, a desire that matched my own. The world outside the attic faded away, leaving only the quiet, intimate space we shared, where time seemed to stretch and bend around us. I could feel the beat of her heart, steady and strong, matching my own in a rhythm that felt ancient, timeless, as if it had existed long before we'd ever met. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, locked in a slow, tender embrace, each kiss a promise, each touch a confession. Her hands tangled in my hair, her lips tracing a path along my jawline, leaving a trail of warmth that made my pulse quicken, and I found myself sinking further, caught up in the quiet intensity of her presence. Eventually she pulled back, her gaze searching mine, and I could see a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, as if suddenly aware of the line we'd crossed, the implications of what had happened between us. But instead of pulling away, she tightened her grip on my hand, a quiet, resolute strength in her expression. "Are you afraid?" she asked softly, her voice a whisper that carried a world of unspoken meaning. I shook my head, my fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, savoring the softness, the closeness that felt as natural as breathing. "No. Not with you." Her expression softened, and she leaned into me, resting her head against my shoulder, a quiet intimacy settling over us. We sat in silence, the only sounds the faint creaks of the house settling and the quiet hum of our breaths, steady and synchronized. As the light in the attic began to fade, casting shadows that danced across the walls, she looked up at me, her gaze filled with an unspoken question, a quiet vulnerability that seemed to bridge the distance between us in a way words never could. I answered by wrapping my arms around her, pulling her close, feeling the warmth of her body against mine, the steady beat of her heart in tune with my own. In that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, wherever this path might lead, we would face it together, bound by the quiet, undeniable connection that had brought us here. And as the last rays of sunlight slipped below the horizon, leaving us wrapped in the quiet, comforting darkness, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet certainty that we had found something rare, something beautiful, and that no matter where it might lead, it was ours to cherish, to hold close, to protect. The quiet darkness of the attic wrapped around us, creating a cocoon that seemed to exist outside of time. Eleanor's presence felt as steady as it was electric, and the warmth of her touch had left traces that lingered on my skin, imprinted like a memory that wouldn't fade. In the stillness, I felt the weight of what we had started, a connection so deep, so unexpected, that it defied the logic of circumstance or the barriers that might have existed outside this space. Eleanor's head rested against my shoulder, her breathing soft and even, and in that moment, I could feel her vulnerability, as if she had let her guard down for the first time. I reached out, tracing the line of her jaw with my fingertips, feeling the way her skin warmed under my touch. She tilted her head up to meet my gaze, her eyes searching mine with a quiet intensity that spoke of trust, of openness, of an unspoken understanding. A soft smile touched her lips as she leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet. "It feels like I've known you forever," she murmured, her words carrying a weight that resonated deeply within me. I nodded, feeling the truth of her words resonate in my chest, an inexplicable familiarity, a sense that we were kindred spirits who had somehow found each other amidst the twists of fate. "I know exactly what you mean," I replied softly, my hand still resting against her cheek. Her fingers intertwined with mine, and we sat in silence, savoring the closeness, the unspoken bond that had brought us together in this forgotten corner of the house. Each moment felt like it was woven from something fragile and precious, and I wanted to hold on to it, to preserve it, even as the world outside waited for us to step back into reality. Eleanor shifted slightly, her hand moving to my shoulder as she leaned in once more, her lips brushing mine in a kiss that was as tender as it was intense. Her fingers trailed down my arm, leaving a line of warmth in their wake, and I found myself lost in the feeling of her touch, of her presence, of the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. We stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms, our breaths mingling in the cool attic air, the world outside forgotten. The quiet intimacy between us felt like an anchor, grounding us in a moment that felt both timeless and fleeting, a secret shared only between us. Eventually, Eleanor pulled back, her gaze lingering on mine, and I could see the faintest trace of uncertainty in her eyes, as if she were holding on to a thought she hadn't yet voiced. I didn't mean for this to happen," she admitted softly, her voice laced with a vulnerability that tugged at my heart. I reached out, my hand covering hers, and gave a gentle squeeze. "Neither did I," replied, my voice steady. "But I don't regret it." A faint smile touched her lips, and she leaned into my touch, her eyes softening as she held my gaze. "Neither do I," she whispered, her voice carrying a quiet conviction, as if the words themselves held a promise, a resolution to let go of whatever fears had once held her back. The silence stretched between us, comfortable and full, and for a moment, it felt as though we were the only two people in the world, wrapped in a quiet understanding that defied explanation. There was no need to speak, no need to question. The connection between us felt as natural as breathing, as though we were meant to find each other, here, in this attic, in this moment. And as we sat there, wrapped in the quiet embrace of the attic's shadows, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me, a quiet certainty that whatever happened next, we would face it together, bound by a bond that neither of us had sought, yet both of us had found. The world outside waited, with its expectations, its rules, its boundaries. But in that moment, none of it mattered. We had found something rare, something beautiful, and I knew, deep in my heart, that we would carry it with us, that it would remain a part of us, woven into the fabric of who we were. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the small window, casting a soft glow over the attic, Eleanor looked at me, her gaze steady and unwavering, and I knew that whatever came next, whatever path we chose, we would face it side by side. And with that quiet promise, we rose, hand in hand, ready to step back into the world, knowing that we carried with us a secret that would bind us forever, a connection that could never be undone.